In 1979, one of the most powerful monarchies in the world suddenly collapsed. The King of Iran fled his own country. Millions of people filled the streets. Statues of the ruler were torn down. His portraits were burned in public squares. And in the middle of the chaos, an exiled religious leader returned to Iran like a conquering hero. That man was Ruhollah Khomeini. In every era, power leaves a mark. History remembers. The world reacts. This is Rowan, and this is Civica Insights. But the story of the Iranian Revolution did not begin in 1979. To understand why millions of Iranians rose up against their own government, we need to go back many years earlier. Back to the reign of a king who once seemed untouchable. His name was Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. For decades, the Shah ruled Iran with enormous power. He was not just a king. He saw himself as a modernizer, a reformer, and the man who would transform Iran into one of the most powerful nations in the Middle East. Under his rule, Iran changed rapidly. Skyscrapers rose in the capital city of Tehran. Highways were built. Universities expanded. Women were allowed greater freedoms compared to many neighboring countries. Western music, Western fashion, and Western culture began to spread across Iranian society. To many outsiders, Iran looked like a country racing toward modernity. But beneath the surface, another story was unfolding. A story of resentment, a story of repression, and a story of growing anger. Because while Iran appeared modern on the outside, politically it was still ruled by a powerful monarchy. Opposition was dangerous. Criticism of the government could lead to arrest. And the Shah had a powerful tool to silence his enemies. A feared organization known as SAVAK. SAVAK was Iran's intelligence and secret police force. They monitored political activists. They infiltrated opposition groups. And according to many reports, they used harsh interrogation methods to control dissent. To supporters of the Shah, SAVAK was necessary. They believed Iran faced threats from communists, radicals, and foreign enemies. But to critics, SAVAK became a symbol of fear, a reminder that the government could watch anyone at any time. Despite this repression, the Shah continued pushing forward with his ambitious reforms. In the 1960s, he launched a sweeping modernization program known as the White Revolution. The White Revolution aimed to transform Iranian society. Land reforms broke up large estates. Education expanded across the country. Infrastructure projects accelerated, and women were granted the right to vote. The Shah believed these reforms would modernize Iran and strengthen his rule. But the White Revolution had unintended consequences. Land reforms disrupted traditional rural life. Many farmers lost stability and moved to cities searching for work. Cities like Tehran became crowded with migrants who struggled to find economic security. At the same time, rapid modernization created cultural tension. Many religious leaders believed the Shah was pushing Iran too far toward Western values. They feared that traditional Islamic identity was being eroded. Among the critics of the Shah was a religious scholar who would later become the most powerful man in Iran. His name was Ruhollah Khomeini. In the early 1960s, Khomeini began openly criticizing the Shah. He accused the government of corruption. He condemned the influence of Western powers in Iran. And he warned that the Shah's reforms were destroying Islamic traditions. These speeches quickly attracted attention, and not just from the public. The government was listening too. In 1963, protests erupted after Khomeini was arrested. Demonstrations spread across several cities. Clashes broke out between protesters and security forces. The government eventually crushed the unrest. But the message was clear. Opposition to the Shah was growing. Soon after, the government decided to remove the problem entirely. Khomeini was exiled from Iran. First, he was sent to Iraq. Years later, he would relocate again, this time to France. From there, he would continue speaking against the Shah. Even in exile, his voice continued reaching Iran. Through smuggled recordings, through cassette tapes, and through supporters who secretly spread his speeches across the country. But during the 1970s, the Shah still appeared firmly in control. Iran's economy was booming. Oil revenues surged. The government spent billions on military equipment, infrastructure, and development. The Shah even dreamed of transforming Iran into a global superpower. But rapid growth created new problems. Inflation rose. Economic inequality widened. Many ordinary Iranians felt they were not benefiting from the country's wealth. At the same time, political freedoms remained limited. Opposition parties were suppressed, and critics of the monarchy continued to face pressure from the state. Slowly, frustration began to build among students, among religious groups, among workers, and even among parts of the middle class. Yet few people could imagine just how quickly the situation would spiral out of control, because by the late 1970s, Iran was approaching a breaking point. A single event would soon ignite a chain reaction. Protests would erupt. Violence would spread. And within a single year, the Shah's decades-long rule would collapse. The Iranian Revolution was about to begin. By the late 1970s, Iran looked powerful from the outside. The economy had grown rapidly. Oil money was pouring into the country, and the government continued building massive projects meant to transform Iran into a modern global power. But beneath this image of strength, something was quietly building. Frustration, anger, and a deep sense of injustice among many Iranians. Many people believed that the country's wealth was not being shared fairly. While the government spent enormous sums on military equipment and grand development plans, ordinary citizens struggled with rising prices and economic uncertainty. Inflation was climbing, housing costs were increasing, and for many workers and students, the future felt increasingly unstable. But economic frustration alone does not usually create a revolution. Revolutions require something more powerful, a moment, a spark. And in Iran, that spark came in January of 1978. It began with a newspaper article. On January 7, 1978, a government-controlled newspaper published an article attacking the exiled cleric Ruhollah Khomeini. The article accused him of being a foreign agent. It mocked him, and it insulted his religious authority. For many religious Iranians, this was more than political criticism. It was seen as a direct attack on a respected religious figure. Outrage spread quickly, especially in the religious city of Qom. Students in religious schools organized protests. Crowds gathered in the streets. They demanded an apology. They demanded justice. But instead of calming the situation, the protests were met with force. Security forces confronted the demonstrators. Shots were fired. Several protesters were killed. At first, the government believed the unrest would quickly fade. Protests had happened before, and the state had always managed to suppress them. But something different was happening now. In Iranian culture, mourning ceremonies are traditionally held 40 days after someone's death, and this tradition would soon become one of the most powerful engines of the revolution. 40 days after the deaths in Qom, new memorial ceremonies were held. People gathered to remember the victims, but these gatherings quickly turned into protests. Once again, demonstrators clashed with security forces, and once again, people were killed. Then 40 days later, it happened again. Another memorial, another protest, more violence. This cycle repeated itself again and again across the country. Each wave of mourning created a new wave of demonstrations. Each clash produced more victims, and each funeral inspired even larger crowds. What had started as a local protest in one city was now spreading across Iran. Cities such as Tabriz saw massive demonstrations. Shops closed. Students marched. Religious leaders delivered speeches condemning the government. For the first time in years, the Shah's authority was being openly challenged in public, and the protests were growing larger with each passing month. But there was another reason the revolution was gaining momentum: technology. Even though Ruhollah Khomeini was living thousands of kilometers away in exile, his message continued to reach Iran. Supporters secretly recorded his speeches. These recordings were copied onto cassette tapes. Then the tapes were smuggled into the country. They spread through mosques, through markets, through private gatherings. People listened to his speeches in secret, then shared them with friends and family. Slowly, Khomeini's voice began spreading across the nation. In his speeches, he condemned the Shah. He criticized corruption in the government, and he accused the monarchy of serving foreign interests rather than the Iranian people. These messages resonated deeply with many citizens, particularly those who believed Iran had become too dependent on Western powers. The Shah had long maintained close relations with the United States, and many Iranians began associating his rule with foreign influence. As protests continued throughout 1978, the government struggled to contain the crisis. At times, the Shah attempted to calm the situation. He promised reforms. He replaced officials. He even allowed limited political openings. But by then, the protests had taken on a life of their own. Different groups were now joining the movement: religious leaders, university students, workers, intellectuals, and even some members of the middle class. Each group had its own grievances, but they shared one common demand: the end of the Shah's rule. Meanwhile, the government increasingly relied on force to maintain control. Security forces were deployed to cities experiencing unrest. Curfews were declared. Protests were banned. But these measures often had the opposite effect. Instead of calming the situation, they fueled even greater anger. Images of violence spread quickly through word of mouth and underground networks. Stories of arrests and shootings circulated across the country. Every incident seemed to bring more people into the streets. By the summer of 1978, the protests had grown into a national movement. Crowds numbering in the tens of thousands were gathering in major cities. Demonstrators shouted slogans against the monarchy. Some demanded reforms, others demanded revolution. Still, the Shah believed he could survive the crisis. After all, he had ruled Iran for decades. His military remained powerful, and the state still controlled much of the country's political system. But events were moving faster than anyone expected, because by the end of 1978, the revolution would reach a turning point, a moment so violent that it would permanently destroy any chance of reconciliation between the government and the protesters, a day that would become known in Iranian history as Black Friday, 1978. On that day, thousands of demonstrators gathered in Tehran to protest the government. What happened next would shock the nation. And it would push Iran even closer to revolution. By September of 1978, the protests in Iran had grown larger than anyone expected. What began as scattered demonstrations earlier in the year had now turned into a nationwide movement. In city after city, crowds gathered in the streets. Students marched through universities. Workers organized strikes. Religious leaders delivered speeches condemning the government. The authority of the Shah was beginning to crack. Yet the government still believed it could restore order, so the Shah's administration made a critical decision. They declared martial law in several major cities. The goal was simple: stop the protests before they turned into something even bigger. Under martial law, public gatherings were banned, curfews were imposed, and the military was given greater power to control the streets. But many Iranians either did not hear the announcement or chose to ignore it. On the morning of September 8, 1978, thousands of demonstrators gathered in Tehran. Many of them assembled at a public square, known as Jaleh Square. The protesters carried signs. Some shouted slogans against the Shah. Others demanded political reforms. Many believed the demonstration would remain peaceful. But surrounding the square were soldiers. Units of the Iranian military had been deployed to enforce martial law. Armored vehicles were positioned around the area. Tension filled the air. According to many accounts, the military ordered the crowd to disperse, but the protesters refused. Some believed the soldiers would never fire on civilians. Others believed that if they stood their ground, the government would eventually be forced to negotiate. Instead, the situation escalated. Within minutes, gunfire erupted. Soldiers opened fire on the crowd. Chaos exploded across the square. People ran in every direction. Some tried to hide. Others attempted to help the wounded. But bullets continued to strike the pavement. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets. No one knows the exact number of casualties from that day. Different reports give different figures. Some say dozens were killed. Others claim the number reached into the hundreds. But what mattered most was not the exact number. It was the impact. The events of that day would become known as Black Friday, 1978, and it changed everything. Before Black Friday, some people still believed the conflict between the protesters and the government might be resolved peacefully. But after the bloodshed in Jaleh Square, that hope began to disappear. For many Iranians, the shooting confirmed their worst fears. They believed the government was willing to kill its own citizens to stay in power. Anger spread rapidly across the country. Stories of the massacre circulated through mosques, universities, and marketplaces. Newspapers reported the violence. Photographs of the dead began appearing. Funeral ceremonies for the victims quickly turned into massive protests. And just like earlier in the year, the cycle repeated. More demonstrations, more confrontations, more anger. But this time, the movement had grown too large to control. Across Iran, strikes began shutting down key parts of the economy. Workers in factories stopped production. Government employees walked out of their offices. Students boycotted classes. Soon, one of the most important industries in the entire country joined the protests: the oil workers. Iran was one of the largest oil producers in the world. Oil exports were the backbone of the nation's economy. They funded government projects. They paid for the military. And they sustained the Shah's ambitious modernization plans. But now, workers at oil facilities began refusing to work. Production slowed, exports dropped, and the government's financial power began weakening. At the same time, demonstrations continued growing larger. Hundreds of thousands of people were now joining protests. Some marches filled entire city streets. Crowds stretched for kilometers. Protesters shouted slogans calling for the fall of the monarchy. And increasingly, many began chanting the name of a man who was still living thousands of kilometers away: Ruhollah Khomeini. Even though he remained in exile, his influence was growing stronger every day. By late 1978, he had moved from Iraq to France. From there, journalists from around the world began interviewing him. Television cameras broadcast his speeches. Newspapers printed his statements. Suddenly, the exiled cleric who once spoke only to small religious audiences was now reaching an international audience. And more importantly, he was reaching Iran. Inside the country, his supporters continued distributing cassette tapes of his speeches. People listened to them in homes, mosques, and markets. His message was simple: the monarchy must end. The Shah must leave, and Iran must create a new political system guided by Islamic principles. As the protests intensified, the Shah found himself trapped between two impossible choices. If he used too much force, he risked pushing even more people into the revolution. But if he showed weakness, the protests might grow even larger. In an attempt to calm the crisis, the Shah made a surprising move. He addressed the nation on television. In the speech, he admitted that mistakes had been made. He promised reforms. He promised political changes. And he declared that he had heard the voice of the Iranian people. But by that point, many protesters no longer believed the monarchy could be reformed. They believed the entire system had to be replaced. Throughout the final months of 1978, Iran moved closer and closer to the edge. Strikes continued spreading. Government authority weakened. And the streets filled with ever larger crowds demanding revolution. The Shah, once one of the most powerful rulers in the Middle East, was slowly losing control of his country. Soon, the situation would reach its final breaking point. Within a few months, the king who had ruled Iran for decades would make a decision that shocked the world. He would leave the country, and he would never rule Iran again. By the end of 1978, Iran was no longer simply experiencing protests. The country was experiencing a full-scale revolution. Across major cities, millions of people filled the streets. Demonstrations had become so massive that they sometimes stretched for kilometers. Entire avenues were flooded with protesters chanting slogans against the monarchy. For decades, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had ruled Iran with near absolute power. But now, that power was slipping away. Government offices were shutting down. Factories were on strike. Universities had become centers of political activism. Even the oil industry, the lifeline of the Iranian economy, had slowed dramatically due to worker strikes. Without oil revenues flowing normally, the government's finances were weakening. At the same time, the morale of the regime was collapsing. Many officials were unsure whether the monarchy could survive. Inside the military, some commanders were beginning to worry about the growing size of the protests. The army was powerful, but could it really suppress millions of people? Meanwhile, the voice of the revolution continued to grow louder, and that voice belonged to a man who was still living in exile. Ruhollah Khomeini. From his temporary residence in France, Khomeini continued speaking to the world's media. Journalists from across the globe traveled to interview him. Television cameras broadcast his statements internationally. His message remained consistent. The monarchy must end. The Shah must leave, and the Iranian people must decide their own future. Inside Iran, his speeches spread quickly. Cassette tapes carrying his voice circulated through mosques, bazaars, and homes. Each new recording strengthened the revolutionary movement. The more the government tried to silence opposition, the more determined the protesters became. By early January of 1979, the situation had become nearly impossible for the Shah to control. The country was paralyzed by strikes. Violence between protesters and security forces continued, and the international community was watching closely. The Shah faced immense pressure from many directions. Some advisors told him to crack down harder. Others warned that a military crackdown might spark even greater chaos. Meanwhile, Western allies, including the United States, were increasingly uncertain about how long his government could survive. After weeks of uncertainty, the Shah made a decision that stunned the nation. On January 16, 1979, he left Iran. The official explanation was that he was going on vacation, but many people understood the real meaning. The Shah was leaving because he could no longer control the country. As his airplane departed from Tehran, millions of Iranians reacted with celebration. Crowds poured into the streets, people danced, cars honked their horns in celebration. In many cities, statues of the Shah were torn down. Portraits of the monarch were ripped apart and burned. For many protesters, this moment felt like victory. The king who had ruled Iran for decades was finally gone. But the revolution was not yet finished, because the question remained: who would rule Iran now? After the Shah's departure, a temporary government attempted to stabilize the country. Officials hoped they could calm the protests and begin rebuilding the political system. But events were moving too quickly. The revolutionary movement had already found its leader, and that leader was preparing to return. On February 1, 1979, after nearly 15 years in exile, Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Iran. His arrival became one of the most dramatic moments in modern Iranian history. Millions of people flooded the streets to welcome him. The crowds were so large that many observers struggled to estimate their size. Some reports suggested several million people gathered in Tehran alone. As Khomeini's plane landed, the atmosphere was electric. Supporters cheered, chants filled the air. Many believed they were witnessing the birth of a new era for Iran. Soon after his arrival, Khomeini addressed the public. In his speeches, he rejected the legitimacy of the remaining government. He declared that the monarchy had lost all authority, and he called for the creation of a new political system. Within days, revolutionary forces began seizing control of key institutions. Protests intensified. Supporters of the revolution clashed with forces still loyal to the monarchy. The situation quickly escalated into armed confrontations. Military bases were attacked. Police stations were seized. Weapons were captured by revolutionary groups. Then came one of the most decisive moments of the entire revolution. On February 11th, 1979, the Iranian military made a dramatic announcement. The armed forces declared neutrality in the conflict. In other words, the military would no longer support the monarchy. This decision effectively ended the Shah's government. Without the military backing him, the monarchy had no power left. Within hours, revolutionary forces took control of major government buildings. Radio stations broadcast news of the revolution's victory, and the final remnants of the Shah's regime collapsed. After decades of rule, the monarchy in Iran was finished. The Iranian Revolution had succeeded. But the revolution had not only overthrown a king, it had opened the door to an entirely new political system, a system unlike anything Iran had experienced before. In the months that followed, the country would transform itself into a new state, a state guided not by a monarchy, but by religious leadership. This new government would soon be known as the Islamic Republic of Iran, and its rise would dramatically reshape the relationship between Iran and the rest of the world, especially one country, the United States, because the next chapter of this story would lead directly to one of the most famous diplomatic crises of the 20th century, the Iran hostage crisis. A confrontation that would permanently change relations between Iran and America. By early 1979, the Iranian Revolution had succeeded. The monarchy that had ruled Iran for decades was gone. The king, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had fled the country, and the revolutionary leader Ruhollah Khomeini had returned to Iran as a national hero. For millions of Iranians, the revolution represented hope. Hope for justice, hope for independence, and hope for a new political system that would no longer be controlled by a powerful monarchy. But revolutions rarely end when the old government collapses. Instead, they often enter a new phase, a phase filled with uncertainty, and sometimes confrontation, because even after the revolution, one issue continued to fuel anger among many Iranians: the influence of foreign powers. For decades, many protesters believed that the Shah had remained in power because of support from Western countries, especially the United States. The Shah had been a close ally of Washington. The two governments had cooperated on military and economic projects. American companies operated inside Iran, and U.S. advisors had worked with the Iranian military and government institutions. To many revolutionaries, this relationship symbolized outside interference in Iranian affairs. These suspicions were deeply connected to an earlier historical event. Back in 1953, the United States and Britain had supported the overthrow of Iran's prime minister during the 1953 Iranian coup d'etat. That coup eventually strengthened the power of the Shah, and many Iranians never forgot it. So when the revolution overthrew the monarchy in 1979, distrust toward the United States remained extremely strong. But tensions would soon escalate even further. In October 1979, a controversial decision was made by the United States. The exiled Shah was allowed to enter the country for medical treatment. At the time, the Shah was suffering from cancer. The American government said the decision was purely humanitarian. But in Iran, the reaction was explosive. Many revolutionaries feared that allowing the Shah into the United States might lead to a repeat of history. They believed Washington might try to restore him to power, or possibly organize another coup. Anger spread rapidly among students and revolutionary groups. Protests began forming around a building in Tehran. The building was the United States Embassy in Tehran. On November 4th, 1979, a group of Iranian students launched a dramatic action. They stormed the embassy compound. The protesters quickly overwhelmed the guards. Within hours, they had taken control of the entire facility. Inside the embassy were dozens of American diplomats and staff members. The students captured them, and they announced that the Americans would be held as hostages. What started as a protest had suddenly become an international crisis. The event would soon become known around the world as the Iran hostage crisis. At first, the students claimed they intended to hold the hostages only temporarily. They demanded that the United States return the Shah to Iran so he could face trial. But the situation quickly escalated. The revolutionary government, led by Khomeini, supported the takeover. For many revolutionaries, the embassy represented something more than just a diplomatic building. They called it a den of spies. They believed it symbolized decades of American interference in Iran. Inside the embassy compound, the American hostages faced a long and uncertain ordeal. Some were blindfolded, others were interrogated. The crisis dominated international headlines. Television networks around the world reported on the situation daily. In the United States, the hostage crisis quickly became one of the biggest political issues of the time. Families of the hostages waited anxiously for news. The American government demanded their release. But negotiations moved slowly. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The hostages remained captive. In Washington, President Jimmy Carter faced intense pressure to resolve the crisis. Diplomatic negotiations continued behind the scenes. But as the months passed, frustration grew. Eventually, the United States attempted a daring rescue mission. In April 1980, American Special Forces launched a secret operation known as Operation Eagle Claw. The plan was complex. Helicopters and transport aircraft would enter Iran. Special forces would reach Tehran, and the hostages would be rescued in a surprise operation. But the mission ran into serious problems. Mechanical failures and a powerful desert sandstorm disrupted the operation. During the chaotic withdrawal, 2 aircraft collided. 8 American servicemen were killed. The mission failed, and the hostages remained in captivity. The crisis dragged on for more than a year. In total, 52 American diplomats and citizens were held hostage for 444 days. Finally, after long negotiations involving multiple countries, an agreement was reached. On January 20th, 1981, the hostages were released. But by then, the damage to relations between Iran and the United States was already done. The hostage crisis had transformed the relationship between the two countries. What had once been a close alliance had now turned into deep hostility. Diplomatic relations were severed, Economic sanctions were imposed, and mistrust between the two governments continued for decades. The events of the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis reshaped politics across the Middle East. Iran had transformed itself from a monarchy into an Islamic republic, and the country now followed a political system guided by religious leadership. For supporters of the revolution, this was a victory for independence and national identity. But for others, it marked the beginning of a new and uncertain era. More than 40 years later, the consequences of those events are still being felt. Tensions between Iran and the United States continue to influence global politics. Conflicts in the Middle East are still shaped by the legacy of 1979. And the story of the Iranian Revolution remains one of the most dramatic political transformations of the modern era. A revolution that toppled a king, redefined a nation, and changed the course of history.